Ryan's parents' house was a haven of peace, situated by a serene lake and surrounded by dense vegetation. The location, isolated from the hustle and bustle of the city, offered him a rare opportunity to enjoy absolute tranquility, especially when he was alone. Nights there were marked by deep silence, interrupted only by the soft sounds of nature, such as the rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of a distant owl. One evening, while watching a program on television in the glassed-in living room overlooking the lake, Ryan began to notice something different. He was sitting in his favorite spot, in the corner of the sofa closest to the window, where he usually enjoyed the cool breeze coming in through the open windows. It was a night like any other, or so it seemed, until an unexpected sound broke the serenity. At first, the sound was muffled, almost imperceptible, as if something or someone was stirring the water in the lake. Ryan, who was immersed in the program, tried to ignore it, assuming it was a duck or some other aquatic animal. However, the sound persisted, becoming clearer and more constant, arousing his curiosity and slowly, a feeling of discomfort. He picked up the remote control and turned down the volume on the TV, leaning closer to the window in an attempt to hear better. Now the sound of splashing water was more distinct, too heavy to be caused by a small animal. It sounded like someone was swimming out there, in the dark, in the middle of the night. Ryan hesitated for a moment, wondering whether he should simply ignore it or investigate. Curiosity and restlessness won out. He got up and went to the door leading out onto the deck. As he opened the door, the cool night air enveloped him, and he forced himself to step outside into the darkness. As he looked out over the lake, all he could see was absolute darkness, interrupted only by the dim lights from the balcony that barely illuminated the water's edge. He stood there for a few moments, his eyes trying to adjust to the gloom, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The sound of splashing had ceased as soon as he had turned on the lights, as if whatever was there had sensed his presence. Ryan shook his head, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that was beginning to creep in. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him, or maybe it really was just an animal. With that excuse in mind, he decided to go back inside, but the restlessness continued to bother him. Back on the sofa, Ryan could no longer concentrate on the television. He glanced at the windows from time to time, but all he could see was the dense darkness outside. Eventually, he convinced himself that it was better to close the windows and lock the door, just in case. With a lingering feeling of unease, he decided to go to bed, hoping that the new day would bring back the normality that night had suddenly lost. As he tried to fall asleep, he couldn't shake off the image of that dark, still, deep lake, where something or someone could be watching him from behind. The following night, Ryan tried to convince himself that the previous day's incident was just a coincidence, an unfortunate combination of a silent night and his own imagination. But as darkness once again fell over the lake and the house was shrouded in silence, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Ryan was in the same room, trying to distract himself with a new TV program, but he couldn't concentrate. His ears seemed attuned to any sound coming from outside, and then, as if the universe was responding to his fears, the noise started again. This time, the sound was unmistakable. It was the sound of someone swimming, but not in a quiet or casual way. The splashes were heavy, urgent, accompanied by heavy, irregular breathing that seemed to echo in the darkness outside. Ryan's heart began to beat faster, and he felt a chill run down his spine. He could no longer ignore what he was hearing. Switching off the lights in the room, he slowly approached the window, trying to observe what was happening outside. The weak moonlight and the shadows of the trees created distorted shapes on the water, making it difficult to see anything clearly. And it was at that moment, while he was trying to discern the source of the noise, that he noticed a shadow passing by the window. The movement was quick, but enough to make his heart leap in his chest. Ryan froze, his eyes fixed on the spot where he had seen the shadow. And then the voice came, low, deep, and loaded with an almost palpable malice. The voice whispered from outside, "I see you." The sound of those words was like a physical blow, leaving Ryan paralyzed for a moment that seemed like an eternity. He knew there was someone there, outside, watching him. But who? Or what? Fighting against the rising panic, he threw himself on the floor, trying to hide behind the sofa. The room was plunged into a deathly silence, broken only by the heavy breathing he could now hear clearly, as if from the other side of the wall. Ryan struggled to keep quiet, his thoughts a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The seconds dragged by, and the sound of breathing began to trail off, followed by light, wet footsteps echoing across the balcony. When he finally dared to raise his head, all he saw was the darkness outside the window. But he knew, with a cold and terrifying certainty, that the intruder was still out there, lurking. With trembling hands, Ryan decided he needed to check that everything was locked. He knew it was dangerous to go out, but the thought of being left defenseless inside the house was even worse. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen, as if that small piece of metal could offer some consolation in the face of the terror he felt, and headed for the door leading out onto the deck. When he finally mustered the courage to open the door and step outside, the cold night air enveloped him, intensifying his alertness. He turned on the outside lights and took a few cautious steps out onto the balcony. And that's when he saw the footprints. They were wet, bare footprints that started at the edge of the lake and headed towards the deck. Each footprint seemed to indicate a careful, almost deliberate approach towards the house. Ryan followed the trail with his eyes until the footprints disappeared into the darkness. But before he could move, he noticed something even more disturbing. There, on the other side of the deck, right on the line where the light from the balcony mixed with the shadow of the night, Ryan saw a pair of eyes. They stared at him, shining with a dark intelligence and an intent he couldn't understand. Time seemed to stop as Ryan and the creature stared at each other. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the presence withdrew into the darkness, disappearing from view. Stunned and terrified, Ryan ran back into the house, locking the door behind him. He knew that whatever was out there wasn't just an ordinary person. Something deeper, more evil, seemed to be lurking around that silent night by the lake. And Ryan felt, deep down in his soul, that it wasn't over. After the terrifying encounter on the balcony, Ryan ran into the house, locking all the doors and windows. His thoughts were in disarray, trying to rationalize what he had just experienced. But nothing made sense. He was alone in an isolated house, and something or someone was watching him with intentions he couldn't understand. With his hands still shaking, Ryan picked up the phone and called the police. As he explained the situation, he felt his voice tremble as he described the pair of eyes he had seen in the darkness. The police arrived quickly, but with caution, due to the isolation of the area. The officers examined the house and its surroundings, illuminating every corner with powerful flashlights. They noticed the wet footprints on the deck, but apart from that, there were no signs of any other presence. The police officers tried to reassure him, suggesting that it could have just been a curious neighbor or someone passing through the area. However, looking into Ryan's eyes, one of them realized the seriousness of the fear the young man was feeling. It wasn't a simple scare. There was something deeper, something that the flashlights couldn't dispel. After the policeman left, assuring him that they would patrol the area during the night, Ryan was alone again. But the feeling of security they tried to convey couldn't erase the terror that had taken root in his mind. He closed all the curtains, checked the lock several times, and left all the lights in the house on. With every noise, his body tensed, and he knew he wouldn't sleep that night. Over the next few days, Ryan became a shadow of his former self. He began to avoid the windows, always feeling that something was watching him from outside. His mind, once occupied with his studies and the small pleasures of life by the lake, was now constantly preoccupied with that invisible presence. He began to hear sounds he couldn't explain, like the light, dragging of footsteps on the wooden floor, or the feeling that someone was watching him through the walls. Nights that were once moments of peace and tranquility became waking nightmares. He would lock himself in his room, surrounded by lighted lamps, but he still felt that the darkness was just waiting to swallow him up. The image of those eyes in the darkness, fixed on him with inexplicable intent, haunted his every thought. Determined not to put up with this anguish any longer, Ryan called his parents, telling them about the nights of terror he was experiencing. They suggested that he leave the house and go into town, where they could meet up. However, even away from the house, the feeling of being watched never completely left him. With every shadow, every reflection, he feared that those eyes were still following him. The days turned into weeks, and Ryan finally left his parents' house. The family decided not to return there for a long time, preferring to rent another house while they tried to forget what had happened. But for Ryan, forgetting seemed impossible. Even today, he wonders what or who was in the lake that night. He never found out the truth, and maybe that's for the best. The memories of that voice whispering, "I see you," and the eyes watching him from the darkness continue to haunt him, even in his dreams. Ryan knows that the mystery of the lake will never be solved, and that's what torments him more than anything else. Because deep down, he feels that that presence is still there, waiting and watching. The house where James lived was old, surrounded by dense forests that seemed to isolate the property from the rest of the world. Although the house had been in the family for generations, there was always something unsettling about it, especially on the darkest nights. James, a 10-year-old boy, felt particularly uncomfortable in his room. Located in the far corner of the house, the room had large windows that looked out onto the forest, where the shadows of the trees moved unsettlingly in the moonlight. James had always been afraid of the dark, but in recent weeks, a new sense of dread had begun to creep into his nights. He owned a nightlight that he always kept on red, a soft light that helped him feel safe. However, he began to notice that some nights he would wake up to find the light changed to another color, or even turned off. At first, he thought it might have been his mother, perhaps checking that he was sleeping well, but this began to happen more frequently, and each time he asked, his parents denied any involvement. At first, James tried to accept the explanation that it could be a problem with the lampshade, perhaps some kind of defect, but the feeling that something was wrong only grew. One night, he woke up in the middle of the night, his heart racing for no apparent reason. As he looked around, he noticed that the light from the lamp was no longer red, but a deep blue that he had never selected. Fear prevented him from going back to sleep quickly, and he lay awake, staring into the darkness of the room, trying to find an explanation for what was happening. James' parents, when questioned, continued to disregard their concerns. They thought it was just the active imagination of a boy who liked to read scary stories before bed. But James knew it wasn't imagination. Something in the room was changing the light, something he couldn't see, but whose presence he felt more and more strongly. Loneliness and fear began to take over his nights as he tried to understand what was really happening in that house. The tension grew with each passing night. James began to sleep less, his sleep disturbed by nightmares and the constant feeling that he was being watched. He knew something was deeply wrong, but with no one to believe him, James found himself alone, facing a terror he could barely understand. James' nights became increasingly disturbing. The discomfort he felt in his room evolved into a growing fear, a feeling that something was lurking in the shadows. He tried to ignore the strange happenings, but this became impossible when, one morning, upon waking up, he noticed that his nightlight had completely disappeared. The object, which had once been a source of comfort, now seemed to have evaporated into thin air. James felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that something more sinister was at play. He rushed to tell his parents, but, as at other times, they dismissed his concerns, attributing the disappearance of the lamp to a possible prank by James or a simple loss. But James knew it was nothing of the sort. He was certain that the lamp hadn't simply disappeared. Something or someone had taken it from his room, and that idea terrified him. That night, while trying to sleep without the light that used to keep him safe, James was woken up again in the middle of the night. This time, however, it wasn't the lack of light that disturbed him, but a sound. From the back of the room, he heard the faint sound of something moving, a subtle, almost imperceptible sound, but clearly coming from inside the cupboard. James' heart raced and he held his breath, trying to convince himself that he was imagining things. But the sound persisted, as if something was crawling among the toys and boxes stored there. The next morning, exhausted and terrified, James once again tried to tell his parents what had happened. However, they still didn't believe him, insisting that it was just the fertile imagination of a child. But James could no longer ignore what was happening. Something was wrong in that room, and he was determined to find out what it was. After several days of sleepless nights and constant fear, James was woken up again by the same scratching sound coming from the closet. But this time, he couldn't stand the terror any longer and screamed for his parents. His father, already irritated by the constant interruptions to his sleep, decided to put an end to it once and for all. He entered James' room and went to the closet, determined to prove that there was nothing wrong. With quick, impatient movements, James' father began to remove the boxes and toys from the cupboard, throwing them across the room while muttering that there was nothing there. However, as he ripped a poster off the inside wall of the cupboard, they both stopped in shock. Behind the poster, there was a hole big enough for a person to squeeze through, and it didn't look like it had been made recently. James and his father stared at the hole, terrified. The hole stretched deep into the wall, disappearing into the darkness. James' father ran out of the house, and outside, after digging a little in the earth, he found the other end of the hole, hidden among the roots of the forest trees. It was a tunnel, a direct path from the forest to James' room. The terror James felt was now confirmed. Someone, or something, was using that tunnel to get into his room at night. His parents, finally convinced that something was wrong, decided that they could no longer live in that house. The discovery of the hole was the turning point, and the family quickly began making plans to move. James, still shaking with fear, knew he would never forget those nights of terror and whatever was on the other side of that hole. He wondered if he would ever find out who or what was coming to visit him in the silence of the night, but part of him preferred never to know. After the discovery of the sinister tunnel that connected the forest to James' bedroom, the decision to move became inevitable. The house, which had once been a welcoming home for the family, now seemed a place of constant danger. The mere idea that someone could have entered James' room at night, unnoticed, was enough to give everyone nightmares. The days following the discovery were a whirlwind of activity. James' parents began packing their things urgently, and James himself, still stunned by what had happened, could barely process it all. The house, which had once been full of childhood memories, now felt like a prison, a place of fear. Every sound from the old house made James' heart race, and every night was spent in vigil, waiting for the slightest hint of movement. The night before the move, James had trouble sleeping. He was in bed, staring at the ceiling, while his parents were still awake, packing the last of their belongings. The thought of the tunnel kept running through his mind. Who or what would be using that hidden path, and why? These were unanswered questions that tormented him incessantly. Suddenly, he heard a familiar sound, the same sound that had terrified him for weeks. The faint scratching coming from the cupboard. James' blood ran cold, and he was paralyzed with fear. Could it be that, even though he knew they were moving, that presence hadn't given up? His heart beating fast, he didn't scream this time. Instead, he slid out of bed, moving as quietly as he could, and grabbed a flashlight from his bedside table. James approached the cupboard, his body trembling, but determined to find out the truth before leaving the house forever. Slowly, he opened the closet door, the flashlight trembling in his hands. He illuminated the interior, but saw nothing but the bare walls. The hole, now a black void, seemed more threatening than ever. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. The silence in the room was absolute, as if time itself had frozen. James felt that there was something in the hole, something watching him. But instead of moving away, he stepped forward, approaching the opening, feeling the darkness almost palpable. At that moment, the flashlight in his hand failed, plunging the room into total darkness. James froze, his fear growing in waves. He wanted to run, to scream for his parents, but something held him there, as if he were trapped in the presence of that darkness. Suddenly, a bright light flooded the room. His parents had come to see what was happening, and on seeing the scene, quickly pulled James away from the cupboard. They closed the door tightly, and without saying a word, took James downstairs, away from that cursed room. The next morning, the move was swift and silent. The family left the house without looking back, leaving behind not only the house, but the mystery that surrounded it. James, still shaken, felt relieved to be away from the place, but a part of him knew that the questions that haunted him would never be answered. Time passed, and the new home brought a sense of security that had long since disappeared for James. However, he knew that the scars of that episode would stay with him forever. Whenever he thought of the old house, he remembered the tunnel and what might be on the other side. Perhaps it was better never to find out. Some truths, he thought, were scarier than any nightmare. It was an ordinary afternoon at school, and the break brought the usual bustle to the corridors. Harry, a reserved and methodical boy, decided to take advantage of the short break to go to the bathroom. He preferred to avoid the hustle and bustle that usually occurred, especially at that time of day. As he pushed open the bathroom door, Harry was greeted by an unexpected silence. The room, usually crowded with other students, was completely empty. The echoes of his footsteps spread through the room, creating a strangely lonely atmosphere. Harry hesitated for a moment, wondering at the emptiness, but then shrugged and entered one of the cabins. As he closed the door behind him, Harry couldn't help noticing how the silence seemed almost suffocating. The sound of the cabin door closing echoed disturbingly through the bathroom. Despite this, he tried to concentrate on what he had gone there to do, ignoring the growing feeling that something was out of place. After all, it was just a toilet, and the fact that it was empty shouldn't be a cause for concern. Harry tried to relax, but part of his mind kept dwelling on the strange stillness that enveloped the room. Even so, he forced himself not to think too much about it, not imagining that this was only the beginning of an experience he would never forget. While in the cabin, Harry began to hurry, still uncomfortable with the silence that seemed thicker by the second. It was at that moment that he heard the bathroom door open with a slow, disturbing creak. The sound made his heart race for an instant. Harry stopped what he was doing and held his breath, waiting to hear the footsteps of someone entering, but the sound never came. The silence returned, even more intense, and Harry felt a shiver run down his spine. He tilted his head slightly, trying to hear any other sign that there was someone there. Nothing, just the oppressive silence. Maybe it's just my imagination, he thought, trying to calm down. But a strange, almost primal feeling of being watched began to take hold of him. Something was wrong, very wrong. Finally, determined to put an end to his discomfort, Harry pushed open the cabin door and stepped out. His gaze swept the bathroom, but as before, there was no one there. He let out a sigh of relief and walked over to the sink to wash his hands. When he looked in the mirror, he saw his friend, Emily, standing in the doorway. She looked restless, and her face was pale. "Who was in there with you, Harry?" Emily asked, her voice trembling slightly. Harry frowned, confused. "What are you talking about? There was no one in there but me." Emily widened her eyes and took a step back. "I swear I saw someone behind you in the booth. It was a shadow. It was standing very close to you." Harry felt the blood drain from his face. The air around him seemed to get heavier, and the fear that had previously been just a subtle unease now turned into dread. He looked at the cabin he had just left, but it was empty. This can't be happening, he thought, trying to find some logical explanation. But Emily's expression, the seriousness in her eyes, indicated that she believed what she had seen. And the disconcerting silence that enveloped the bathroom seemed to corroborate the presence of something or someone who shouldn't be there. Panic seized Harry, and he instinctively took a step backwards, almost tripping over himself in his haste to get away from the cabin. His eyes scanned the bathroom once more, looking for any sign of movement, any hint of the presence Emily claimed to have seen. But the space remained empty, shrouded in that unbearable silence. Without saying a word, Harry grabbed Emily's arm and pulled her towards the door. They hurried out of the bathroom, their footsteps echoing down the empty school corridor. The feeling of being watched, of something invisible following their movements, didn't leave Harry. It was as if the shadow Emily had seen was still around, lurking, waiting. Every sound seemed amplified. Every shadow in the corridor seemed to hide something else. When they finally reached the classroom, Harry could no longer contain the fear that consumed him. He turned to Emily, his voice shaky. "Are you sure what you saw?" Emily nodded, her gaze still haunted. "I saw it, Harry. It was there. Almost glued to you. It was like a shadow, but different. It was dark, as if it sucked in all the light around it." Harry tried to process her words, but his mind refused to accept what it could mean. Determined to find an explanation, he ran to the teacher who was on duty in the corridor, quickly reporting what had happened. But the teacher, a man already used to stories about imaginative students, just laughed and patted Harry on the shoulder. "That's just your imagination, Harry. Those old corridors have a habit of playing tricks on people. There's nothing to worry about." Harry wanted to believe it. He really wanted it to be true, but the unease inside him wouldn't go away. He returned to the classroom, trying to concentrate, but the memory of what Emily had described continued to haunt him. For the rest of the day, he avoided the bathroom and the quieter corridors, always making sure that Emily or another friend was nearby. The following days were no different. Every time he needed to use the school toilets, Harry called someone to accompany him. The idea of being alone in that space, where the shadow had appeared, was unbearable. The image of the shadow, dark and disturbing, remained in his mind, haunting his thoughts and his nights. Whatever had happened in that bathroom, Harry knew he couldn't forget it. And despite the reassuring words of the adults around him, he never again felt safe alone in the school corridors. The shadow in the bathroom had left a permanent mark, a persistent fear that would stay with him forever.